Awesome. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us for our demo debate for the West Coast Debate Institute. We have on the affirmative team, Norma Delgado. She's from Lambdo, an alum from Lambdo, and her partner is going to be Albert Cardenas, also from Lambdo. Woo woo. And then on the negative team, we have Jonathan Mesa, also from Lambdo, an alum. Thank you for being here. And then Carlos Carrasco from Lambdo as well, another alumni. So they're gonna be, they're on the neg team, and we're gonna do a little demo debate. So let's get right into it.
Okay, can y'all hear me? Am I fine? All right. Okay, I'll just get started. First is inherency. The 2005 Halliburton loophole means that hydraulic fracturing operations are exempt from EPA regulation. Clinton et al. 2001. In 2005, under the Bush-Cheney administration, the Energy Policy Act freed fracking from regulations required by the Environmental Protection Agency's Underground Injection Control Program, which is designed to protect underground drinking water sources. This set of exemptions became known as the Halliburton loophole. The reality of the Halliburton loophole is that it allows companies to inject massive amounts of potentially harmful chemicals into the earth and pollute the air without disclosing what they're doing. The fracking industry has sidestepped an astonishing list of federal regulations, including the Clean Water Act. Next, fracking is still going on in the Gulf of Mexico and leaks pollutants into the ocean. Sakashira 19. The federal government permitted more than 1,600 fracks in the Gulf from 2010 to 2014. Fracking uses toxic chemicals that can harm loggerhead sea turtles and other imperiled marine life. Federal records showed oil companies were allowed to dump more than 76 billion gallons of drilling wastewater, including fracking chemicals, into the Gulf in 2014. Federal waters in the Gulf of Mexico are where the vast majority of offshore drilling occurs in the United States. At least 10 fracking chemicals routinely used in offshore fracking could kill or harm a broad variety of marine species, including marine mammals and fish. And next is global diversity is on the brink, risking total extinction. Einhorn 20. The world is failing to address catastrophic biodiversity collapse that not only threatens to wipe out beloved species and invaluable genetic diversity, but endangers humanity's food supply, health, and security. Human activity was decimating animals and plants across the planet, causing a wave of extinction, throwing ecosystems so out of balance that the domino effect threatens humans themselves. The biggest driver of biodiversity loss on land is habitat destruction and degradation. And next is contaminated fracking water kills biodiversity, Lohan 19. Spills highlight the dangers that come with unconventional fossil fuel extraction techniques that go after harder to reach pockets of oil and gas using practices like horizontal drilling and high volume hydraulic fracturing. And while many of the after effects of fracking has grabbed headlines for years, such as contaminated drinking water, earthquakes, and even flammable faucets, the consequences of wildlife have been left out of the national conversation, but those consequences are real for a vast suite of animals. Next is, all this damage makes sense when you think about fracking's outsized footprint. And next is, biodiversity loss threatens human extinction and global crises, Plummer 19. Humans are transforming Earth's natural landscape so dramatically that as many as 1 million plants and animal species are now at risk of extinction, posing a dire threat to ecosystems that people all over the world depend on for their survival. For a long time, people just thought of biodiversity as saving nature for its own sake, but this report makes clear the link between biodiversity and nature and things like food security and clean water in both rich and poor countries. As these natural landscapes wither and become less biologically rich, the services they can provide to humans have been dwindling. So the plan. The United States federal government should substantially increase its protection of water resources in the United States by amending Section 1421D of the Safe Drinking Water Act to remove the exemption for underground injection activities pursuant to hydraulic fracturing operations relating to oil or natural gas production activities and prohibiting hydraulic fracturing in the Gulf of Mexico. Onto solvency. Plan gives EPA purview over fracking discharge, requires research for impact of fracking and discharge, and allows for civil enforcement. Tianmen and Van 13. EPA might determine the need for any new regulations and decide whether to adapt the existing regulatory framework or to develop a new approach under the UIC program. Section 1449 provides for citizen civil actions against any person or agency allegedly in violation of provisions of SDWA or or against the EPA administrator for alleged failure to perform any action or duty that is not discretionary. This provision could represent an expansion in the ability of citizens to challenge state administration of oil and gas programs related to hydraulic fracturing and drinking water if hydraulic fracturing exemption provisions were repealed. And that's time. I'm open for cross-ex.
All right, time for cross-ex. My first question is, why is biodiversity important?
Yeah, so our evidence points to biodiversity causing bad things from threatening our food security to threatening things like human security by harming marine life. So those are like some of the first bad things of biodiversity, but there's more like domino effects, as we explained.
For sure. How does the AF solve for biodiversity?
Yeah, so the plan does two things. The first thing the plan does is that it bans fracking in the Gulf of Mexico, where the majority of offshore drilling takes place, which not only effectively stops companies from drilling in those regions, but also the plan institutes a system of accountability by expanding citizens' ability to sue oil companies when they're violating the Safe Drinking Water Act. And in amending that section, it creates that check.
All right, is fracking one of the only issues that affect biodiversity, or are there other factors?
I mean, we can point to several factors that point to biodiversity, but as explained in the Lohan evidence, I believe, it explains that pollution, specifically water pollution and degradation, is what causes a substantial portion of biodiversity collapse and damage.
Okay, for sure. So why is it urgent that we pass the plan now if it's been over a year since you said Earth's biodiversity would be lost?
So there's a few reasons. We think that this problem with fracking is just a problem waiting to happen. As we've seen, spills cause contaminated water toxic waters and toxins to leak into drinking water and the oceans, which not only harm marine life, but the set of exemptions also makes it so that we allow companies to continue to dump. So not only is this like a problem that's already happening, but we need to do our part to prevent further damage of biodiversity loss before it's too late to recover.
For sure, sounds good.
Okay, yeah. Now
Hello,
you
hello.
can see me. Okay.
Cool. So the 1NC, next speech. I'll be ready whenever. Let me get my own time. Sorry. Okay, I'm ready. On 3, 2, 1, go. I say the affirmative doesn't solve. Greenberg 21. The most notorious oil and gas exceptions is the Halliburton loophole, which exempts hydraulic fracturing from the SDWA underground injection control, UIC, regulation. The Halliburton loophole deserves the attention it receives and should be reversed. However, the significant shortcomings of the UIC program means that closing this loophole and regulating fracking under the UIC program would not be enough. A vast array of activities that impact water lie outside the scope of either of these laws, including discharge of produced water into unlined pits, spills that may impact soil or groundwater, reuse of produced water for agricultural or other reasons, chemical use in mixing, land application of wastes, and water consumptions by the industry. Next, the status quo regulation solves. Oskalane 21. Industry also carefully manages water at the surface of all stages of operation. Technological state regulatory advances have allowed producers to minimize use of fresh water sources in favor of non-potable, lower quality water or produced water. Water reuse within the oil and natural gas industry is also encouraging development of more efficient, more mobile water treatment technologies that could eventually be scaled and utilized by other industries. The federal government creates framework and environmental laws that often prescribe regulatory minimum thresholds for states to follow. These programs assess the quality of the surface waters, set standards for protection of the waters, and establish plans to bring impaired waters back into attainment with water quality goals. Regulation requires oil and natural gas operators prepare spill prevention, control, and countermeasure plans, implement controls, establish BMPs to prevent impacts to receiving water bodies from tanks and other structures that hold oil on site. Next, current fracking precautions more than enough, the net benefits outweigh, or 15. The EPA cites more than 950 scientific sources and finds no evidence hydraulic fracturing has led to widespread or systemic impacts on drinking water sources. Any oil and gas development in the parks must meet strict federal environmental standards and National Park Service regulation to protect air, water, and wildlife. Banning fracking on all federal land is irresponsible and bad policy. Oil and natural gas development has occurred safely on federal lands for decades, while bureaucratic red tape has caused productions of these resources to fall sharply. Next is the plan gets circumvented by the courts, takes too long, and doesn't solve for the majority of fracking. Natter 2020. Fracking, which involves pumping water, sand, and chemicals underground to free oil and gas from dense rock formations. Even if Biden wanted to, he couldn't unilaterally ban fracking on private lands. Under a 2005 law, the EPA has almost no regulatory power over fracking. Changing that would require an act of Congress. A regulation banning fracking on federal land we have to go through a process that will likely be challenged in court as a violation of federal law that encourages oil and gas development. A Biden administration could take a page from Obama's playbook and freeze new leasing to allow time for a thorough evaluation of the environmental impacts of oil and gas development on federal land. A broad ban on new drilling permits, even as lease sales, would be difficult for Biden to impose immediately. Both federal law and Bureau of Land Management Resources Management plans governing territory under their agency's control mandate regular lease sales, and oil companies could challenge regulators' inaction or permit denials for the leases they hold under contract law. The impact will be limited since most fracking occurs on private land, not public. In 2017, more than half of New Mexico's oil production and nearly 67% of all natural gas production occurred on federal lands, according to the same group. Next, we'll be addressing the biodiversity advantage here. Fracking improves U.S. environment, mitigating warming, Pierce 12. Replacing coal with gas in the U.S. will reduce total emissions of greenhouse gases attributable to electric generation by 45%. Replacing coal with gas will have other significant environmental benefits as well. Elimination of the tens of thousands of premature deaths and hundreds of thousands of illnesses in the U.S. each year that are caused by inhalation of pollutants emitted by coal-fired generating plants. The benefits of the U.S. gas boom to the transportation sector, direct use of the compressed natural gas in vehicles, and or by increasing the direct use of natural gas by increasing the number of vehicles that are powered by gas-generated electricity. Next is no impact. The impact is exaggerated and outdated. Data says species count is fine. AF negatively impact conservation efforts, Costello 19. The recent assessment of the states of the world's biodiversity claimed that 1 million species are threatened with extinction, and the extinction rates are higher than those in the past. Neither estimate is helpful to conservation, and both may be counterproductive in the claim that millions threatened species are under threat based on outdated DC statements. That's time. Unless you want me to finish? No. Time.
2-minute cross-sects, right?
Yep, I'm open.
All right. Okay, so your last card, your Oscandian 21 evidence suggests that current state measures have resulted in the use of less fracking water for fracking projects. I mean, is there a way to quantify how much that is?
We believe the quantification of how much less fresh water is being used is irrelevant if the trend of that use proves that more of said less fresh water is constantly improving, which means the efficiency is the goal of these processes, which will lead to the overwhelming use of accessible and more efficient water practices.
Okay. My next question is, if you say that the status quo regulations are solving now, what's stopping for like water contamination from affecting oceans?
Sure. As mentioned in the previous cross-sects, we also believe that if the industry practice around fracking is to improve the conditions of water usage already, if this was a debate about stopping water contamination altogether, then it wouldn't be just about fracking anymore.
Okay. My next question is, can you please elaborate further on why fracking is a good thing for the U.S. environment?
Sure. Our Pierce 12 evidence, which was the second to last card we read, states in the first part of the card that replacing coal with gas in the US will reduce total emissions of greenhouse gases attributable to electric generation by 45%. The evidence later explains that premature deaths due to inhalation of pollutants emitted by coal-firing generating plants is, as the negative would believe, something that if is possible to avoid, we should avoid by replacing coal usage with gas, which would imply that the use of fracking is better than using the coal.
Okay, my final question is, with the Costello 19 evidence claiming that there aren't millions of known species, rather there's 27 species, why does that mean that we should care less about that? Or why does that mean that the plan is a bad idea?
Sure. We believe that the offset in the Pierce 12 evidence that there are millions of lives that are being avoided, that could avoid the deaths of not only illnesses, but inhalation of pollutants due to coal use can offset the potential loss of biodiversity. And the no impact card that was the Costello 19 evidence believes that even if there is a reason for those, even if there was a reason why that claim is true, we believe that the estimation would hurt conservation efforts regardless. So let's cross.
And I'm going to go on the case, and I'll start with some extensions. Sorry for the background noise. And then later going on to impacts, and I'll be signposting. So. On the case, the affirmative forwards the amending of Section 1421 of the Safe Drinking Water Act so that it eliminates fracking activity in the Gulf of Mexico. Our Clinton et al. 21 evidence stresses the inherency of fracking in the Gulf of Mexico and how it is exempt from EPA regulation. Contrary to what the negative says, means that current regulations aren't enough, and the Gulf is still being subject to harmful practices. You should prefer our evidence as it's more current. Their evidence is from April 14th, whereas ours is from April 26th. Next, our Sakashita 14 evidence shows that the Gulf of Mexico is where most federal fracking projects occur. 76 billion gallons of wastewater were allowed to be dumped into the Gulf in 2014. We can only conclude that millions of gallons have been dumped since then. Next, our Einhorn 20 and Lohan 19 evidence contextualize the significance of fracking as it correlates with human activity that risks disastrous consequences like harm to wildlife, which is key to preserving biodiversity. And that's the biggest driver of biodiversity loss. And next, we shouldn't just be preserving the environment for its own sake, but for ours as well. Our Plummer 19 evidence highlights the link between biodiversity loss and water scarcity and food security. If there is a lack of environment where these things can be fostered, then it will drive humanity to extinction. We have to enforce these protections before it's too late to even make protections. On to solvency. Av key to EPA regulation and testing pollution from source fracking wells in the Gulf of Mexico. Truth Out 17. A review of the draft water pollution permit for oil and gas operations in the Gulf reveals how difficult it can be to uphold federal clean water standards in oil and gas operators are allowed to dump an unlimited amount of wastewater overboard, but certain conditions must be met in order to keep water quality near drilling platforms within federal standards. Toxicity testing is not required at the source of the wastewater. This is a major concern because there are thousands of platforms operating in the Gulf and the EPA has no clue about the cumulative impact of various mixing zones because officials have yet to completely study the issue. On to circumvention. No circumvention. Legislation checks for legal standing. Blanchard 21. A federal judge issued an order Friday dismissing a lawsuit brought by Pennsylvania State Senate Republicans to strike down a ban on fracking in the Delaware River Basin. U.S. District Diamond issued the ruling. Plaintiffs' inability to make outstanding confirms that this dispute is primarily partisan and is best resolved through the political process. On to biodiversity. We can play the numbers game. Even if there's not a million known species at risk of extinction, 27,000 known species are still listed at risk. That means that the plan is still a good step in the direction of environmental conservation. And their Pierce 12 evidence is in the context of transitioning from coal to gas in the US. This is a process that may bring about a good energy shift to mitigate climate change, but the risks in achieving that are too great to continue. Next, fracking harms birds and disturbs their habitats. Koblinski 18. Louisiana water thrushes specialize in nesting habitat among forested streams are negatively impacted by nearby shale gas development. The industry began booming in 2008 in these areas. Researchers began studying the birds in 2009. Unlike other birds that might venture across several habitats, these birds use only areas by streams. Whatever happens to the streams happens to the birds. They are bioindicators. Next. And birds are key to stopping biodiversity collapse. Fowley 10. Birds and the information we hold about them can be used to focus and stem biodiversity. Action is urgently needed to stem the loss of natural habitats and halt human-induced extinction of species. Birds signpost some very practical ways to make progress. Birds are very useful for identifying the specific actions required to meet these new targets and for tracking the implementation and impact of such actions. And with that, I am open for cross-sects.
Cool. All right, we're good?
Yeah.
Awesome. So my first question is going to be, that last piece of evidence that you started reading was talking about how fracking would hurt certain bird populations, and the harms of said bird populations would be not being able to determine what to do with the land around those populations. How exactly does a population of birds determine how we can better help the environment? As in,
Oh, okay. So the Foley 10 evidence, or actually not the Foley 10, but the Koblinski 18 evidence indicates that birds are pretty useful to observe, and they use the term bioindicators. So when fracking projects begin, they can disrupt like nesting habitats, and that'll cause certain species like birds, as it's highlighted, to move to different territories, different forests, and disrupting that'll create things like invasive species, and disrupting one habitat eventually just means disrupting another ecosystem because there's an introduction of a new species.
Right. Okay. So earlier in your speech, right before you got to insolvency, you made a point of saying that preserving the environment for everybody should be a highlight of why we should be voting affirmative. But then you also said that the transition to gas energy instead of coal energy is too risky. So why would it be too risky to try to do the exact same thing of preserving the environment for everybody, which would become the immediate result of moving to gas energy versus coal energy?
We think that that current practices at the rate that they're moving in conjunction with other with other human activity that degrades the environment is too much of a risk. Whereas we should just take the risk of protecting the waters now before it's too late to actually even make a move to protect waters. Does that answer your question, or?
Okay. So in my speech, I'll be giving a roadmap first. I'll be taking on our case arguments. Specifically, I'll be taking the advantage, and I'll just be discussing about the advantage for this speech. All right. If everyone is good, I'll be good to start. All right. I want to start off by extending our Pierce 12 evidence. It talks about how fracking is good for the US environment and how it helps mitigate warming. There's a really big argument here that if we stop fracking, will we be replacing like gas usage with coal usage, and it will only increase natural greenhouse gases in the United States by 45%. That means replacing coal with gas will only significantly worsen environmental impacts. So if we are keeping gas issues and keeping using forms of fracking in order to get gases, we are able to stop the usage of coals and also other forms of non-renewable energy. And that means that we are able to resolve any forms of overwarming. So it means that even if the AF can bring up that there is some stuff that is wrong with fracking, fracking does prevent us using coal, which means that it prevents any form of overwarming. Next, you could also extend the Costello-19 argument. There is no impact to fracking, or there is no impact. It's very exaggerated and outdated. There's been recent research about biodiversity, and it's claimed that 1 million species have been threatened with extinction, but the extinction rates have been really, really low, and there hasn't been really any impact forms of extinction. And there's also other arguments in this area, specifically that there's other issues and other factors that can affect biodiversity, which means that even if the AF is able to solve, that does not mean that it's able to resolve all issues of biodiversity, which means that there'll still be some sorts of issues that the AF cannot resolve. Next, I will talk about how fracking is good, specifically how fracking improves the economy. This is Pierce 12. Fracking has increased US natural gas reserves by 75%. The Energy Information Administration, EIA, expects this trend to continue. Results of fracking gas cost less than 1/3 of prices of oil in the US. Fracking has already produced large numbers of new jobs and major increases in prosperity in Pennsylvania and Ohio and many other states. There will be an increase in manufacturing activity by reducing significant cost of energy, and it will encourage major investments in chemical production facilities. Natural gas as a feedstock will also reduce transportation costs as heavy trucks, construction equipment, and trains are converted from expensive petroleum products to cheaper natural gases. And benefits of fracking far outweigh risk. Risk benefits include lower greenhouse emissions and job creations. Whitehead 19, it has been 10 years since the combination of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing technologies reversed the United States position from that of energy scarcity to energy abundance. This has changed the economy for long haul, and in the process thrust the term fracking into the mainstream American lexicon. Decades worth of scientific data clearly reveals that fracking's benefits have far outweighed its risk, and those risks have been routinely exaggerated or flat out made by shale opponents. Increased natural gas uses made possible by fracking and the resulting low prices and primary reasons the United States have reduced carbon emission by 13% since 2008, more than any other nation in the world so far this century on a raw tonnage basis. There's also no significant evidence to support claim that fracking adversely impacts water on a wide space basis. 24 scientific reports released over the past 10 years show that fracking is not a major threat to groundwater. Environmental Protection Agency report even noted that hydraulic fracking operations are unlikely to generate sufficient pressure to drive fluids into shallow drinking water zones. Anti-fracking activists also claim that fracking increases air pollution and impacts public health, but once again, increased natural gas use made possible by fracking has actually led to dramatic reductions of emissions. The risk of harmful health effects is low for residents living near oil and gas operations. Environmental and health-related calamities that anti-fracking activists claim would create have simply not materialized over the last decade. Thanks to fracking, literally millions of jobs have been created and energy prices that are at a low all-time low, not only helping Americans make more money, but keep more money in their pockets. We are also reducing greenhouse gas emissions at the same time as our economy soars, which is reasons why fracking is good. Okay, I'm good for cross-sects.
Okay, so how exactly is fracking beneficial for the economy?
Okay, so our last piece of evidence we read explains how fracking is good for the economy in two ways. First is that fracking provides a bunch of jobs because of the way that the manufacturing works and the way how bringing up these gases from the ground works. There needs a lot of like labor and lots of people. So a lot of people get these jobs in order to pull out the gases. Second is that it's a substitute for coal and other forms of non-renewable energy, which means that it stops gas emissions, which means that it stops forms of energy and it saves money for like the general public because they aren't spending as much on other energy businesses.
Okay, and can the economy survive without a fracking industry or without an intensive fracking industry?
Well, we would argue that without fracking, there'll be big like chunks of damage being done, i.e. a lot of people will lose their jobs and there'll probably be a lot of more expensive uses. We'll probably have to go back to using coal, or we'll probably have to go back to using other forms of energy that will be a bit more expensive than gas.
Okay. And my last question is, so earlier a Costello 19 was read, and it claims that there aren't a million known endangered species, rather 27,000 known species that are at risk. So my question is, if we can even at least do something to assist those 27,000 known species, why is the plan still a bad idea?
I think in the one in our bottles we'll get up and also say how the plan doesn't solve, but I think that that amount of numbers of species isn't worth the risk of the economy going down or a lot of people losing jobs. So it's a form of like we take and get, we give and take. So if we take this like, oh, we stop fracking and we'll be able to solve for these 20,000 forms of species, it also leads to some backlash, such as like people lose jobs and will like have more carbon emission, and that is a bad. We're arguing that that is a bad form of like trade-off.
Okay.
Cool. Can y'all hear me? Yeah, okay, cool. So I'll start the 1NR right now. Okay, so the roadmap of this speech will be, I'll be mainly taking the solvency question, the solvency arguments, and this circumvention argument that keeps being repeated. But at the top of my rebuttal, I want to highlight this argument that Jay Meza said that I think will be the locus of this debate. And I feel like the 1AR has to respond to this. I feel like the 1AR has to respond to this energy transition question. I feel like we feel as a negative that energy transition is a worthy risk. Even if fracking was bad, the judges should consider that if there was a risk that current practices would lead to better water protections in the status quo, the AF would only force us to rely on coal. And that means that in a world in which everyone here votes affirmative, there is a instance or a risk that we over rely on coal, which would lead to a not only potentially worse scenario for the same biodiversity the AF claims to solve for, but if the risk is the same, then we might as well let the status quo resolve itself. We also claim that the AF forces us to rely on coal. That's worse. There hasn't been any extrapolations as to why biodiversity loss is worse than the deaths of millions due to coal inhalation, plus the potential risks of voting affirmative. And to elaborate on the no impact argument we had earlier in the 1NC, claiming millions claiming of millions of biodiverse species being lost reduces people's ability to act, because it does the opposite the affirmative wants. If people are worrying about millions of species being lost, they're less likely to act on that, because it's an overwhelming amount of things that the affirmative can't guarantee to solve for. It may claim itself to be a starting point, but it's not enough. We also believe that circumvention is not impossible. The instance of one judge throwing out a case does not represent the entirety of the legal system or the court system, which would prove that if there's a risk and the AF agrees there's a risk that circumvention could happen, the AF isn't relevant at all. And my last point is that there hasn't been a response to this loophole argument, which means that even if the AF passes, there can still be fracking on private land. So even if fracking is bad, the affirmative can't do anything to stop that loophole from existing. We believe the 1AR and 2AR should also respond to these arguments, or it will be hard for an AF ballot to be justified.
The 2005 Halliburton loophole created a real problem for biodiversity conservation and food security. The Clinton et al. 2021 evidence explains that current federal laws allow for oil and natural gas companies to inject massive amounts of harmful chemicals into the earth and pollute our oil, and they don't even tell us what they're doing, because current regulations aren't enough to prevent water contamination. We just don't have sustainable methods to dispose of wastewater, and it's a problem that's just waiting to happen. Lack of transparency now means that we can't actually know the extent of the detrimental effects on marine life, but we do know that at least 10 fracking chemicals routinely used are harmful and could kill a broad variety of marine species, including marine mammals and fish. So the Plummer 19 evidence will explains that people depend on thriving ecosystems for their survival, and spills are harmful because they cause waste. And currently, fracking companies keep disposing of their waste by dumping it into waters, which harms oceans. And the plan does two things. It bans fracking in the Gulf of Mexico, where the majority of offshore drilling occurs, and according to the Sakashita 19 evidence, and it amends Section 1421 of the Safe Drinking Water Act to remove those exemptions and create an effective check against oil companies that exploit loopholes by expanding the citizens' ability to sue, thus creating a long-term system of accountability. This resolves the concerns for private land and also resolves the issues with circumvention, because there's no way this plan gets circumvented as a legislative act. Their own evidence says this. Also, the long-term consequences of fracking are unsustainable and outweigh the short-term benefits of low energy costs. So you prefer we should enforce federal regulations over fracking, which in order to protect our ecosystems, which are dying now. And so also the plan creates a demand for renewable energies, which resolves the reliance on coal. Yes.
All right, so this debate is pretty simple. You can vote negative here. First is on the biodiversity advantage. They have conceded that there's not like 10,000 or a million forms of species that are threatened, but only 27,000, and that means that there is a very, very smaller impact that they have to solve for, which means that at the end of this debate, we have to choose whether 27,000 endangered species that may or may not be affected by fracking, or may not be only affected by fracking, should be outweighed over then by the risk of going back to coals, or the risk of losing a bunch of jobs due to fracking being taken away. I think that if you could extend our arguments made in the block that fracking improves the US economy, mainly by providing for a bunch of jobs and for increasing the use of natural gas reserves by 75% and reducing the usage of coals and other burning forms of unrenewable energy. I think that there's a bunch of arguments here, especially when we said that the effects of going back to coal, the effects of not using gases as the form of unrenewable energy is that there'll be more greenhouse gases emissions due to coal, and that means that there's going to be a bunch of environmental impacts as well, which means that we are able to access their biodiversity impacts because it also affects animals and other forms of species because of the greenhouse emissions being passed. So it means that even if you believe that these 27,000 species are important, they're still going to be affected post-AF because there's still going to be increase of greenhouse gas emissions, and they'll be affected by that, a part of the economy going bad and people losing jobs, which means you should not prefer that.
Am I good to go? Okay. This debate is about whether there should be more federal protection over waters in the Gulf of Mexico. We have provided 3 reasons as to why you should favor the affirmative. 1, currently, fracking activity is exempted from EPA regulation, and that's worrisome because fracking projects pose a risk to the quality of drinking water due to leaks and spills. So you should prefer our Clinton evidence on this point since it's the most recent in relation to fracking in the Gulf of Mexico. It's the most cited area in terms of fracking, and it's recorded that 76 billion gallons of wastewater has been dumped back into the Gulf. That's hazardous liquids that disrupt the oxygen levels for aquatic species, wildlife that depend on that water, and water systems that provide drinking water to humans. That means we're consuming this. 2, that is environmental degradation, contaminated water, fracking fluid blowing back into the atmosphere, which is harmful for humans to breathe in. The negative wants to talk about carbon emissions. Fracking projects do the exact same thing and lowers the quality of life for different species. The negative talks about the impact of economic jobs being lost. We're poisoning the Gulf, and if we don't stop it, it's just going to lead to a chain reaction of other ecosystems collapsing, in which we cannot live without because we depend on a healthy environment so that we can sustain ourselves. That leads to extinction. There's no coming back from that. It's too much of a risk compared to a couple of thousand people losing their jobs. Jobs won't matter if humanity is dead. And 3rd, the plan solves. If we give more authority to the EPA to regulate fracking activity, then there would have to be more planning and research conducted so that the impact of a potential spill or leak can be known. And they say circumvention, we say no circumvention. Even if it is a one case of a judge throwing out a case, we don't think that the plan would be stalled on such a grand scale that it wouldn't create a significant impact on waters.